League of Legends is the best game of all time. Now that I have your attention with a blatantly false statement, say what you will about League of Legends, but the art in League is undeniably great. There are some fantastic designs and even better splash art. But what makes it great, and how can we learn to do the same? Today we're analyzing and breaking down several League splash arts and making up videos, and then creating our own using what we learned. First off, I picked 6 of my favorite League splash arts, and we're breaking these down into value, color, and composition. Value and color are of course a big part of composition, but I feel like during analysis it can help to heavily compartmentalize these stages. 3 steps also sounds more like I know what I'm doing than just 2. So let's splash into value, and that makes no sense. Let's dive and make a splash into splash art. If you're unfamiliar with what values are in the art context, it's essentially light and dark. All color has value, but not all value has color. How do League of Legends artists use value? I've picked some of my personal favorite splash arts and some that I found interesting. If we make these black and white, we can get a clearer look at the values without color muddying them. We could also compress the values to get a clearer read on shadow, midtones, and highlights. What we're seeing in almost all these pieces, and what is emblematic of a lot of splash art, is either a dark silhouette on a light background or a light silhouette on a dark background. Really dialing in that contrast and creating a lot of interest for the character, which is the main point of a splash art, highlighting the character. To further add to that, we're also seeing lots of contrast in the faces, which is typically where you want your viewers to look, whether this is done with shapes like in the Fiddlesticks piece, or with values like in the Cassiopeia art. The composition on the Z art is also very interesting, and we'll dive deeper into this one in the composition step. There's such a fine balancing of values going on here, namely pulling the contrast back near the weapon with fog or mist to not distract too much from the character, which is very secluded in shadow. So, to summarize values: dark on light or light on dark. Lots of contrast and detail around focus points. Keep in mind how your values will lead your viewers' eyes. Now let's lead our eyes too. Like I mentioned earlier, all colors have value, so this will of course intertwine with the previous analysis, but there are a few things that are separate and I want to talk about it real quick. Most splash art is very saturated, strong colors, a lot of saturation, particularly on the focal points. This Fiddlesticks piece goes pretty heavily against that. It's very desaturated, set a scary mood. He's also British, which adds to the fear. The piece also has almost exclusively cold colors, but the character itself has these nice hints of red that lead the eye right to him. Almost the direct opposite of this Mbessa piece, which has this bright saturated red in the background, and the rest of the piece is quite desaturated for contrast and drags you right into the character. Really cool. The remaining pieces use points of high saturation either to silhouette or to highlight the character. Again, very typical for splash art. A great compositional trick is framing, which is what it sounds like, getting your stepdad convicted of possession. Now, framing your character in some way in your painting. We see this in almost all these pieces, some more obvious than others. Fiddlesticks is very clearly framed between these 2 buildings. Cassiopeia is framed beautifully by the Shogi door. Yone and Mbessa have less clear examples, but they're framed by these background elements. Next we're talking about flow, which really is more vibes based than an exact science. I don't know if anyone remembers the Pringling meme that hit Twitter that made fun of this exact thing. But it's important to know that these lines I'm squirting on top of the paintings are probably not what the original artist was doing, it's just a tool for analysis. And yes, the Pringling thing annoyed the fuck out of me because it confused a lot of beginners, and people keep bringing it up and thinking they're the funniest guy on the planet and not mommy's least funny little basement dweller. Sorry, distracted. What I mean when a piece has good flow is that there's leading elements that lead you to the focal point or focal points. Cassiopeia's tail leads you right into the piece. Every element in Mbessa's splash arts leads you to her face. Now, the Z art is really interesting, because it almost leads you away from Z and into the background, to the car and the statue. Which then kind of leads you back, but not really. It's a really interesting composition, and I'm surprised it works. Fiddlesticks' flow kind of coincides with the framing. His weapon and his tongue leads you around the piece very nicely as well. Now again, where you find flow in pieces is going to vary from person to person, and you just gotta find what you like and what works for you. It's again not a science and not a rule. With our analysis out of the way, it's time to develop an inferiority complex as we tackle making our own League of Legends style splash art. I'm starting my painting with thumbnails, which is very common for commercial illustrations to test out ideas and find the one you like best. Or the one your boss likes best. You can also see this in official breakdown videos by actual League artists. God, that looks good. For my illustration, I'm painting Bomb Devil from the Chainsaw Man anime. Partially to show that you could use these techniques for any character in any setting, and also because I wanted to explode my balls into smithereens. For the first thumbnail, I'm picturing her blowing through a wall, maybe in a school or an office building, keeping the lessons we learned from our analysis in mind. I'm making the character dark on a light background, adding a frame which in this case is the walls and pipes. I like keeping my thumbnails pretty loose, since usually they're just for me. If it's for a client, I typically refine them a bit more so it's clear what's what. Second thumbnail. There's a scene in the anime where they go swimming in a pool, and I just wanted something reminiscent of that. This piece has the advantage of water, which you can shape into just about anything to improve the composition and add leading elements. Our third thumbnail, and the one I ended up going with, is this scene of her with a massive explosion in the background in a street corner. Again, massive advantage here with a really bright explosion which makes the character stand out super well. This does have the downside of having to paint multiple buildings, which definitely isn't one of my strengths. But we try our best, and if we fail, we scrap the whole video and pretend it didn't happen. If we apply our previous analysis to this thumbnail, you can see we get our frame, our contrast, our flow, and hopefully we'll get our color as well. Starting work on the actual illustration, I'm adding some fast and loose line art to separate areas and make it more clear what needs to go where. I'm not adding super clean line art because then I tend to feel constricted and scared to make changes, versus if I keep things kinda loose. But that's of course just the way I like it, you should do whatever works for you. This early in the illustration, I like to make a clear plan and do all the hard parts and have everything thought out so I can just zone out and paint for the rest of the process. So, to get a clear handle on the buildings in the background, I'm breaking out Blender and setting up some basic shapes to get the perspective and some basic lighting right. We see this in a lot of behind the scenes videos for Riot splash art. A good example is this Gwen art video by Dave Calvis, where they're setting up the whole background and even the pose for the character in 3D, which does a lot of the hard work for free and has become almost essential in modern art productions. If you're looking for free options for this, Blender is an amazing option and could do just about anything 3D related you might need, but it does come with a pretty steep learning curve. For specifically characters and posing, there is Daz, which technically is free unless you pose a character, but comes with a lot of optional add-ons you can purchase if you need them. You could even make an entire illustration in 3D if you wanted to, all depends on your goal with the piece. Are you trying to maximize painting knowledge, or are you just pushing out a piece of work and have to keep speed in mind? Another really important part of my process is reference. Here I took some photos of my own hands just to make sure I get the anatomy right. While I could probably eke out some decent hands without it, it would take a long time and I'd rather make sure I nailed them. I do unfortunately end up changing this hand altogether later anyway. It just looked a little awkward. With our quote-unquote line art plotted out, I'm now going in and adding a value for each element on the character. The skin, armor, clothing, and so on. Then I'm adding a new layer on top of this with a big shadow and then carving the light out of the shadow for my values. Now that we have a basic overview over how our values are going to look, I'm playing around with color. Sometimes I do colors in my thumbnails and go from there. Sometimes I go from black and white to color, which is what I went for this time. Specifically because I know explosions look really good with a gradient map, which is a layer effect that adds colors to values. So the color you put here gets assigned to black and the one over here to white. I started off with this orange and teal setup, which are complementary colors. Then I went in on top of this and added more colors to make it more saturated and vivid. No set process here, just feeling it out and looking at other League splash art for reference, trying to get the same vibe. At some point though, the teal and the orange became barely visible anymore, but it worked as a nice base. We have our plan laid out, we know the composition, the perspective, the values, the color, and all that's left now is to paint and make this finished. From here on out took about 15 hours, partially due to my own dilly-dallying and indecisiveness. As I'm painting, I'm trying to keep my layers separate, like a picky eater that separates icky from yucky. This is so I could very easily change things if I wanted to. I can move the character a couple pixels, or make the entire character darker or lighter very easily. This does however mean I end up with close to 300 layers by the time this is done. Which again, of course, is just personal preference, you could paint this all on one layer if you're insane. I spent a lot of time trying to get these cracked windows in the background to work, but they just ended up very distracting, and I eventually removed them to make the character stand out better. It's important to be able to get rid of stuff even if you spend a lot of time on them, if it benefits the piece. Try not to get too attached. If you're working under someone, they could also ask you to change stuff you might really like, and you have to bite your tongue and change it, and then steal some of their hair when they're not paying attention and craft a small puppet of them to yell obscenities at in your office. Here's also me redoing this hand for what felt like the 10th time, and hopefully I keep this version. I don't, I change it again later. Another thing a lot of splash arts do that I noticed is adding a big bloom of bright anywhere those suit the composition. They're not scared of adding unrealistic lighting effects, they're doing anything they can to improve the piece. The anatomy doesn't have perfect, nor does the lighting have to be correct. All that matters is the piece looks great and grabs your eye. I'm also comparing my art to the splash art I have for reference as I go, trying to get a similar level of detail, saturation, and dynamism. Keyword being trying to, of course. At this point, there was a specific piece I was looking at a lot, as it was very reminiscent of my own. This Senna splash. It has a big explosion in the background and a small cityscape, just like mine. I'm comparing the saturation, the values, the effects, and adding or removing based on it. You can tell there's way more dynamic elements and little goodies in this piece. There's rocks flying around, debris, dirt, motion blur. These cool little rainbow splashes that I don't quite know what they're called, but damn they look cool. So I tried incorporating all these elements as well, and it really took the piece to a next level. This clip's a little out of order because my head is dented, but just adding a little bit of branding to the storefront here. This little ribbon is one of my favorite parts of Bomb Devil's character design for some reason. It's just a perfect little nested detail on an otherwise plain white button up. And finally, the last time I changed this hand and arm up. I picked a new pose and shot a new reference photo. I think this pose works better. It's a little less awkward and looks more mid-combat compared to the previous ones. And then the last minute change of removing the cracks in these windows. It looked cool and made sense, but it just distracted a lot from the character's silhouette. Along with the effects, I'm also adding some texture to the head. It's pretty subtle, but this gives you the extra layer of finish. This is done with a custom brush that I then blend in with opacity and erasing. And with this, our splash art is done. I'm really happy with this, and I think it captures the character and really draws your attention. Is it as good as a League of Legends splash? No. If I was as good as a Riot artist, I'd be working for Riot. I think the background is a little lacking and the character could take up more of the screen. It is a character splash art after all. But at some point you have to call an illustration done and use what you've learned in the next one. Thank you for watching. This whole piece was streamed live on my Twitch channel, on which I'm live currently about 5 days a week doing painting, animation, and 3D. Hope to see you there, and please subscribe here on YouTube as well.